Izuku Midoriya tried to like heroes. He really did. That was difficult, however, when it had only been a month since the #1 hero himself had crushed Izuku's dreams like a stale cracker, and then simply watched as Kacchan was attacked. Izuku wondered what would have happened if Death Arms hadn't prevented him from running in at the last minute. Maybe he would have impressed All Might, who would have taken him on, taught him how to be a hero. Izuku scoffed at his own thoughts. Him, a quirkless loser. Impress All Might? Yeah, right. As it was, All Might had gotten his act together eventually, and Kacchan had been alright, if unconscious, when he was retrieved from the sludge villain's body, and Izuku had spent the last month quietly selling off all of his All Might merchandise, and harboring a growing resentment towards Hero Society. Which is what led him to where he was now, sitting at a sketchy internet cafe, about to tell a random internet acquaintance, who in all probability was a villain, how to kill a minor hero. He'd found the post on one of the more underground hero forums, the kind that often include posts about vigilantes and villains alongside the heroes. Izuku didn't necessarily want to be on it, but he was holding out onto a hope that if he just continued doing the things that he enjoyed before everything went to shit, then he might eventually start feeling the spark of something besides anger. The post itself hadn't been that long. Just one question. From Why Heroes 301. Completely hypothetically, how would one go about killing Mount Lady? A simple post like that shouldn't have changed his life. Izuku should have just ignored it, or maybe told the police, especially after he'd read through the user's old posts and discovered that even if they weren't a villain, they were definitely a villain sympathizer. He should have not given it a second thought, and turned to more reputable forums to try to dig himself out of his growing depression. Instead, he did none of that. For the next week, the question repeated in Izuku's mind like a broken record, his mind latching onto anything that could cut through his apathy. How would one go about killing Mount Lady? She was a new hero, prideful and media-hungry, which might explain why she was one of the hero world's rising stars, but Izuku knew she had weaknesses. He found himself at more and more of her fights over the next week, trying and failing to convince himself that he was only there because he liked Mount Lady, not because he was analyzing her weaknesses. It had taken him only 3 days to realize that his hero analysis notebooks contained enough information on heroes' weaknesses that he could probably kill any hero he wanted to with a little work. The thought made him sick, but it still didn't stop him from seeking out Mount Lady's fights, and it definitely didn't stop his brain from obsessing over how to kill her. It would be laughably easy, Izuku realized, to use her love of the media against her. Pretend to be a reporter and lure her into a densely populated area with narrow streets to prevent her from using her quirk. Ask for a selfie and stab her through the heart while her eyes were focused on the camera, then blend into the crowd before anyone could realize she was dead. He tried to leave it at that. He knew how to kill her, so he didn't really need to be thinking about it anymore. After the week he'd had, he really should have expected that putting the issue out of his mind wouldn't work. Anyway, it was all hypothetical anyway, right? What was the harm in private messaging the poster and describing his plan, as well as a few backups just in case? After all, it wasn't as if the poster was actually a villain, just a villain sympathizer. Mount Lady probably wouldn't end up dead, and Izuku could make a dummy account at an internet cafe just in case, so that no one would be able to track his IP address, and then he'd never have to use the account again, and maybe he'd actually finally be able to stop thinking about this. A little over an hour after walking into the internet cafe, Izuku signed out of the account he'd made, Mastermind 404, and walked out of the front door, feeling oddly relieved. Izuku Midoriya tried to like heroes. It didn't work. Izuku's life went about surprisingly unchanged after his brief descent into, maybe, villainy. There had been several times since then when he found himself on the verge of a panic attack, wondering what he could have been thinking, sending off his notes like that. Every time he'd manage to calm himself down by justifying that the person he'd messaged probably just thought he was some creep for taking his post seriously. The poster hadn't even expected a response. He was just venting frustration, probably, so nothing was going to come of it. He wondered in those moments if he was a bad person for feeling sad about that fact. He knew he was. It had been 8 days since Izuku had messaged the poster, and he had just finished bandaging himself up from Kachan's latest attempt to put him in his place. The beatings had become even worse since the sludge villain attacked. From what Izuku could gather about Kachan's rants in between his explosions, he was trying to prove that he wasn't some weak-ass victim or something like that. The end result was that Izuku spent most of his life, nowadays, alone and in pain. But how is that any different from every day since he turned 4? Izuku was just tugging his shirt down to hide the bandages as he left the bathroom when he heard his mother gasp and drop a pan in the next room. He ran in to find her staring open-mouthed at the TV and the news anchor standing on what was normally a busy street. The back shot lit with flashing police sirens. As of yet, the police have very few leads on the identity of the attacker, only saying that he may have some sort of stealth quirk considering how quickly he was able to disappear in the aftermath of Mount Lady's death this afternoon. A vigil will be held for the fallen hero. Isn't that terrible, Izuku? She was such a new hero, too. Who would do something like this? His mother turned back into the kitchen, trying to distract herself by preparing dinner. Izuku simply stared at the TV in shock, not really seeing much of anything. The poster had been serious after all. He'd actually done it, which means that he, Izuku Midoriya, a hero fanboy, was now accessory to a hero's murder. Izuku started to hyperventilate, only to be violently knocked out of his upcoming panic by another thought. Mount Lady was dead, and that meant that he, a quirkless Deku, had beaten a hero. An unfamiliar, warm feeling welled up in his chest, and he fought down a smile. He wondered if this made him a bad person. He knew it did. Chapter 2. Hope for the Future. Despite his best efforts, Izuku found himself at an internet cafe, logging into his Mastermind account a little under 2 weeks after Mount Lady's death. The TV in the corner is playing the news, and even now they won't stop talking about the murder. There's even talk about putting a memorial up where she was killed. Every time he hears about it, he feels this strange mixture of pride and nausea, the same feeling he felt every time he considered logging into his account. He knew that he should just let it lie, but recent events had shown how not great he was at that. Once his brain had latched onto a problem, it would not rest until it was dead. Literally, in the case of Mount Lady. He clicked on the little envelope at the top of the screen, seeing a notification for 4 new messages. He opened the oldest one first, the only one from the original Mount Lady poster. New message from Y Heroes 301. Thanks for the plan. I couldn't have done it without you. Well, I couldn't have gotten away with it, at least. I know your reasons for helping are your own. Mine are too. But just know that you ever need anything, I got your back. Well, Izuku thought that was nice of him, at least. He sat back and took a deep breath. No one had ever thanked him before. Well, not including his mother. Goodness knows Kachan never did. It felt really good if Izuku was being honest with himself, even if it was coming from a murderer. The thought made Izuku nauseous again. Just how desperate for attention was he, if a compliment from a villain was enough to send him over the moon? He really was as pathetic as Kachan was always saying, wasn't he? Izuku shook his head in an attempt to yank himself out of his self-pity spiral. If he let that get going, he might be there for hours, and he really didn't want to stay logged in on his villain account longer than necessary. He pointedly ignored the voice in the back of his head that said having a villain account wasn't supposed to be necessary at all. It was then that he noticed the note had a postscript. P.S. I hope you don't mind that I told a few friends about your account. None of them are cops, so don't worry about any snitches. Izuku hurriedly clicked back to check his inbox, trying not to panic. He refreshed the page twice, willing the words on the screen to change, but when had anything ever actually paid attention to what he wanted? 3 new messages. From villains. It wasn't like Izuku could justify it like last time, by saying he didn't know for certain that these were villains. They'd been referred to him by a murderer, specifically because he had apparently made a murder plan. There was no way they weren't villains. This was terrible. What had he gotten himself into? Hey kid, are you okay? Izuku jumped when the teenager who had been running the counter put a hand on his shoulder. He hadn't even realized he'd been hyperventilating until that moment. He nodded, willing the worker to just go away, but apparently he wasn't that great of an actor because the worker just stood there, looking concerned. Izuku took a few deep breaths, both to calm himself down and to convince the worker that he'd be fine. When he felt he'd staved off the panic attack, he met the worker's eyes. Thank you for your concern, but I think I'll actually be heading home now. The worker nodded and walked back to the counter as Izuku signed out without reading the other messages. He considered deleting the account, but the worker was still eyeing him with concern, so Izuku didn't want to take that long. He almost sighed in relief when he walked through the doors. No doubt, if the worker had seen anything incriminating on the screen, he would have just called the cops rather than helping Izuku through a panic attack. He pulled at his hood self-consciously as he turned towards home. Someone thought he was useful. The thought almost stopped him in his tracks, but he managed to just trip over air instead. Somebody thought he was useful. Sure, that someone was a villain, but somebody thought he was useful. That means he wasn't just a worthless Deku. Bad Izuku. He shook his head. As great as that compliment felt, it was still coming from a villain, a murderer, and murder was wrong. Izuku reminded himself that this was a world he didn't want to be caught up in, and didn't want to associate with murderers, despite the fact that they seemed to be the only ones who didn't see him as a waste of space. Murder is wrong. Izuku didn't want to be a villain. He just had to keep reminding himself of that. Izuku kept his head down as he walked to his seat in the back of the classroom, mentally willing himself to become invisible. Kachan had been quiet for a few days, which normally meant that an explosion was coming. He was so concerned with not meeting Kachan's eye that he didn't notice the foot sticking out in the aisle until he was already going down. As it was, he knocked his chin hard on one of the desks and just barely avoided biting his tongue as the class roared with laughter. Midoriya! The teacher called out, and Izuku felt his hope rise. Was the teacher actually going to step in this time and put an end to the bullying? He had to have seen that guy trip him, right? If you're quite finished being a disruption, I'm going to begin the lesson. Izuku looked up at the teacher from his place on the floor, shocked. The teacher saw what happened, and he was still turning a blind eye. Izuku sat shocked for a few silent seconds before looking down at the floor and nodding. He could already begin to feel the blood drip down his neck from where his chin hit the desk, but it was obvious that he wouldn't be going to the nurse's office today if his teacher's initial reaction was anything to go by, so he just grabbed his handkerchief from his bag and held it to stop the bleeding as he hurriedly found his seat, as the teacher began to talk. So, everyone, I know that everyone has already decided what high school they want to go to, and that most of you are headed for heroics. However, due to the highly competitive nature of the field, we are obligated to dedicate time to a career planning workshop to make sure that you know about the other career paths that are available to you. Take one of these worksheets and pass the rest back. You will have the whole period to work on them, so just raise your hand if you have any questions. Try to keep in mind your quirks, skills, and talents when weighing your options. Most of the students started to move around as soon as they received their worksheets, going to sit by their friends, and the noise level gradually increased as everyone started up side conversations. Izuku turned his attention to his paper and started to think of the careers that didn't involve heroics. After all, even if All Might didn't think it was possible. Oi, Deku! Izuku tensed at Kacchan's tone. What now? So, he could tell by the smirk on Kacchan's face that whatever he was about to say wasn't going to be pretty. But he doubted he could do any worse than the suicide baiting which had become almost common since the sludge villain incident. Teach said we were supposed to pick career choices based on our quirks, skills, and talents, but you don't have any of those. So what can you even do? Quirkless Deku like you is so useless, you'll be lucky to hire him to take out the trash. His lackeys surrounding him laughed, and Kacchan looked at Deku with a self-satisfied smile as if he'd just told the greatest joke of all time. But then again, Izuku thought bitterly, everything Kacchan does is the greatest. Izuku tried to ignore the jibe and just do his worksheet, but Kacchan's words unfortunately got him thinking, and he pulled out his phone to Google jobs for quirkless people. The results loaded slowly, thanks to the school's cheap internet, but they were no less shocking when they finally appeared. Quirkless unemployment, an epidemic? Quirkless discrimination, fact, fiction, and class ceilings. Quirkless unemployment, statistics. Izuku skimmed through the articles, frantically at first, and with more numbness as the hour went by. Of all quirkless people who lived to adulthood, which was only about half since the suicide rates were so high, almost 80% of them were unemployed. Of the lucky 20%, almost all were making minimum wage, and the exceptions were mostly older professionals who'd been hired and promoted back when quirklessness was more common. If someone had asked Izuku that morning what would be more harmful, a throwaway insult in the homeroom or the beating that Kacchan gave him after school, he would have said the beating hands down. In actuality, though, he barely felt the explosions and hardly remembered patching his wounds after. The fact that quirkless unemployment was the first result looking up statistics on the quirkless was rather telling, but that couldn't apply to Izuku, right? After all, Izuku was smart, capable, and determined. He avoided thinking back to those 3 messages sitting in his villain inbox. He wouldn't have a problem finding a job if he really put his mind to it. It wouldn't be just another statistics, living on the street because of something he was born without, right? Charging to kill heroes would pay the bills at least. Izuku tried to shake the unwelcome thought from his mind as he watched up for dinner, but it stuck there like a stubborn piece of gum. After all, on the internet, no one knew he was quirkless, and his skills obviously spoke for themselves. Yeah, he might have to worry about avoiding the police, but he could bypass the invisible walls that kept the quirkless in their place, as Kacchan would say. No, bad Izuku. He tried to calm down by having a staring contest with himself in the bathroom mirror, then went out and joined his mother at the table. Murder is wrong, right? No, Izuku wouldn't become just another statistic. He couldn't let himself become a villain either, despite how tempting that would be, but what should he do? You're awfully quiet tonight, sweetie. Izuku startled out of his thoughts. His mother was looking at him with concern and pity in her eyes. God, he was so sick of pity. Practically begging him to tell her what was wrong. He couldn't do that. She wouldn't understand, but what could he tell her? He smiled slightly as an idea occurred to him. I want to try to get a job, he blurted out. His mom's eyes widened slightly at first, but then her face relaxed with relief. She probably thought it was something a whole lot worse. If only she knew. I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetie. What brought this on? She smiled. We had a career day at school, and I thought it would be helpful to get some experience to help me decide. Izuku lied easily, and wow, wasn't that just concerning. Just let me know if there's anything I can do to help you, his mom teared up. I'm so proud of you, Izuku. After a few more tears, Izuku finally finished dinner and went on to his room to start his plan. This was his chance. If he could find a job, despite being quirkless, then that would mean the statistics were wrong, and there was hope for his future. If he could get a job, then he really had no reason to turn villain here, right? As Izuku researched job openings and began filling out online applications, he made a deal with himself. If he got a job, he would delete his Mastermind account. And if he didn't, well, he supposed he'd cross that bridge when he got to it. Chapter 3. The Job Search. Most of the applications Izuku filled out were submitted online, but he found a few that wanted him to drop them off in person, so that's what he dedicated his Saturday to doing. He was feeling pretty confident in himself. He'd filled out almost 24 applications, and the economy wasn't that bad due to All Might's presence, so there was no way that he wouldn't be getting a job. He hadn't even been all that tempted to log into his villain account since he decided to find other employment. He smiled as he walked through the door of the McDonald's he was applying for, and was promptly knocked down. "What the hell are you doing here, useless Deku?" Izuku looked up to see one of Bakugo's followers. The one that could stretch out his fingers. What was his name? Bakugo always just called him Fingers. He caught sight of the crinkled application in Izuku's hand, and he laughed. "Oh, you're applying here too? Why would they hire a quirkless idiot like you when they could hire someone normal who actually has a quirk like me?" "Maybe because I have better grades and a better work ethic, not to mention a better record, and I happen to know for a fact that you have a few marks on yours from getting into fights with kids from other schools." Izuku didn't say that out loud. Instead, well, there's no harm in trying." Fingers just smirked. "We'll see. May the best man win." He brushed past Izuku, letting his knee hit Izuku's head on the way out. Izuku scowled as he watched him leave, and then took a deep breath and got up, brushing himself off. He unwrinkled his application as much as possible by rubbing it on the flat edge of one of the tables before heading into the office to turn it in. Izuku hung up the phone in despair, wishing he had one of those phones he'd seen in pre-Quirk era movies just so that he could violently slam it down on the receiver. It had been 2 weeks since he started looking for a job, and so far, he had only had one interview. Almost everywhere else had either never called him back, or simply let him know that they didn't feel he was the right fit for our company. The one interview he'd gotten was with one of the companies that didn't ask about his quirk on the application. The interview had been going really well, and the people in charge seemed to like him, at least until they finally asked where his quirk was. The interview hadn't lasted long after that. He didn't even know why it hurt so much that he didn't get the job. It wasn't like he'd been expecting it. He sighed and crossed them off the list with red pen. There were still a few companies he hadn't heard back from. Maybe it was time to hit the pavement and follow up. Show initiative. Or maybe it's time to give up. At least the villains let your skills speak for themselves. Izuku calmed his breathing and let his panic fuel his determination. If there was anything he was good at, it was not giving up. He scanned the list, skimming past all of the lines crossed off in red until his eyes picked up on one company. McDonald's. He had to drop the application off in person, so it made sense to follow up in person. He hurriedly grabbed his keys and put on his shoes, looking in the mirror on the way out to make sure he looked presentable. "I'm heading out, Mom," he yelled back into the house. "Okay, honey," she yelled. "Be home for dinner. Be safe. Don't go chasing too many hero fights." He chuckled, and he locked the door behind him. Izuku stood shocked still, mind turning as it tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Fingers stood behind the register in full uniform, the bright yellow M on his hat standing out mockingly against the black. He didn't have a trainer shadowing him, so it wasn't even his first day. He caught sight of Izuku standing by the door and smirked before turning back to the customer at the register. Izuku didn't bother going back to the office to ask about his applications. If they'd hired Finger, who applied the same day, it was obvious they'd already made their decision. He walked out the door in a trance. Stupid discrimination. Why? Why did it have to be this way? Why wouldn't they even give him a chance? He arrived at the internet cafe before he even realized where he was going. He hesitated for a moment. Yeah, discrimination sucked, but was he really ready to walk head-on into villainy? He wouldn't be able to justify it this time by saying he didn't know how the person would use the info he gave them. Was he really ready for this? He remembered the smirk that Fingers shot him when he dropped by a McDonald's. He remembered Bakugo burning him, calling him useless, while the teachers watched and did nothing. He remembered being told to kill himself. Izuku pulled up his hood so security cameras wouldn't catch his face before walking into the cafe with his head held high and paying for an hour. He signed into his villain account and went straight into his inbox. He hadn't received any new messages in the weeks since he signed into that account, but the 3 villains from before were still unread. He read over them quickly. A minor hero, a sidekick, and, oddly enough, a bank robbery for Izuku to plan. This would be interesting. Pro hero Stretch found dead near cafe. Sidekick at Ed Shot Agency killed in a villain fight. Tokyo Gold Bank down 10 billion yen after bank robbery. Izuku tried to bury his guilt as he read the headlines. After all, the world had put him through hell his whole life. He figured it was about time he returned the favor. Chapter 4. Embracing the Role. It had been 6 months since Izuku's fateful encounter with All Might. It seemed like a lot longer to Izuku. A lot had changed since he was a bright-eyed kid holding on to the dream of becoming a hero. He'd learned a lot about computers and hacking to help with his villain work, and he was planning on going to a high school that emphasized programming. He still did most of his villain work in internet cafes, but moved around frequently to prevent being tracked. He also tried picking up as much as he could about money laundering to prevent anyone from tracking his funds. His prices went up with each plan he sent out, and he had yet to reach a point where his clients refused to pay. He'd also been cleaning Dagobah Beach. It had started as a way to deal with his guilt after becoming a villain. Maybe if he did something good for the community, it would cancel out all the harm he'd caused. Izuku was gradually coming to terms with his new life, letting the bitterness of society combine with his pride as a job well done to drown out his regret. He didn't get panic attacks anymore when he opened the news and saw that one of his plans had been carried out. He still got nervous and somewhat nauseous, but even that was starting to get replaced with satisfaction. It didn't hurt that every message in his inbox fed his ego, as villains were constantly thanking him or demanding him for his services. For the first time in his life, he had people who didn't think he was useless. It was like a drug, and Izuku could not get enough of it. So far, he'd sold the murder plans for 10 heroes, and that wasn't even counting the numerous robberies, non-hero assassinations, and other crimes that he had planned. But people were starting to catch on. Conspiracy theorists online were starting to connect the recent uptick in hero deaths, and even the police were starting to suspect that there might be one person behind it. Villains were starting to come to him with higher profile targets, but were also starting to demand face-to-face meetings rather than just through a screen. Which was why he'd never stopped cleaning the beach. He knew that one act of good wouldn't make up for the bad he'd done, and he was getting to the point where he didn't want it to. But it was excellent muscle training, and he needed to be strong if he expected to survive in the world of villains. Izuku caught movement out of the corner of his eye as he hefted a microwave and began to carry it towards the dumpster. He had started to suspect this morning, but now he was sure. He was being followed, which meant that somebody had managed to figure out that he was Mastermind. The only question was who. Izuku continued his task without letting on that he knew that he was being watched, opting instead to keep an eye out and get a description of the stalker. Hopefully it was a villain. Izuku didn't quite know what he would do if the heroes caught onto his identity this early in the game, so yeah, hopefully villain. Izuku had to resist, chuckling to himself. What had his life become? By the time he left the beach at sundown, he discovered that his stalker was a middle-aged man with gray hair, a goatee, and apparently a love of cheap suits and cigarettes. He was pretty good at staying out of sight, but Izuku had years of experience hiding from bullies and, more recently, stalking heroes himself. He breathed a sigh of relief. This guy was almost definitely not a hero, but if he'd managed to find Izuku, he must have significant connections in the underground. Izuku made a note to check his notebooks when he got home. Izuku had become much more paranoid since he'd thrown himself into villainy, Call it a combination of a guilty conscience and an anxiety disorder or whatever. But the end result was that Izuku was neurotically careful when it came to not getting caught. He had an irrational fear that somehow a cop would try posing as one of his clients online, get him to send a murder plan for a hero, and somehow use the IP address to track him and take him to jail. Yeah, maybe Izuku had been watching too many crime dramas, but it could happen. Anyways, he started to learn about as much as he could about the villain underground so that he could reasonably vet his clients. It helped that he started asking about his clients' quirks and skill sets so that he can incorporate them into his plans, but the majority of information came from the darknet and hacking into some of the less secure police databases. Just like he had notebooks of information on heroes, he now had them on villains, and it came in handy in unexpected ways. One client a few weeks ago had commissioned him to help their group rob a casino. It was a difficult job with a big payout, so Izuku had only demanded part of his fee up front. After the job was done, he messaged the client about getting the rest of his money, and he had gotten the response of, "Thanks, but you should be lucky with what you got, and you're not getting any more from us." Idiots, really. He'd vetted them beforehand and checked their quirks with the police agency, so he knew where they were, and where they lived, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. In the midst of his fuming, it hadn't taken him long to find a few villains with a grudge against their little group. It turns out Izuku was not the only one these men had tried to screw it over. It was a little harder to find out how to contact their enemies, but once he did, they seemed more than happy to pay Izuku for the chance to take them down. Needless to say, no one had tried to cheat Mastermind out of his fee since. It came in handy now as he looked through the descriptions of various known villains in an attempt to figure out who was following him. The guy did not have an obvious quirk from what he could see, but who would have a reason to come after him? A previous client? No dice. Izuku continued rifling through the pages until... bingo! Jiran, a broker. Izuku leaned back in his chair. Of course. The name nagged at him, though, like he should be more familiar with this guy than just a passing entry in his journal. His eyes skimmed over the notes, lingering on the known connections list, when a note he'd made in the margin caught his eye. More specifically, a username. Oh, right. Jiran was the broker who'd reached out to him online a few times early on, offering to arrange meetings with the big-name players in the villain world and provide any necessary gear. Izuku soundly refused. He had been so new to the game when Jiran had reached out that he hadn't yet grown comfortable with calling himself as a villain. He had also been scared. One of the main reasons he liked working online was that his skills could speak for themselves. He had a sneaking suspicion that Mastermind's credibility would tank the moment word got out that he was just a quirkless teenager. Things are different now, Izuku mused. Yeah, I'm a quirkless teenager, but at least I've gotten used to the fact that I'm a villain now. I've got a reputation. A big reputation, if the copycat masterminds popping up to sell inferior plans was anything to go by. A reputation I need to uphold. So far, Izuku had been able to take care of the copycats very quickly, using the same methods he'd used for cheating clients, but no one could ever be too careful. Maybe it's time to finally start showing a physical presence. And with that, Izuku pulled out a notebook and began to make plans. Chapter 5. First Meetings. It had been a week since Jiran started following him, and Izuku was beginning to get frustrated. The guy was supposedly one of the best brokers in the underground, and was obviously good enough to find him, so 1 week should be more than enough for him to confirm his suspicions. Izuku knew that he didn't really look the part of a villain, because what criminal mastermind lets him get bullied every day? But come on! It was with these thoughts that Izuku decided to deviate from his normal daily routine, a routine that Jiran should be familiar with at this point if he's been paying any attention. Hopefully, his annoying stalker would come out of the woodwork if given a good enough opportunity. If not, Izuku might just walk right up to the guy and punch him in the face. Actually, He winced as he thought back to his inability to fight against his bullies. Probably not. Izuku wound his way through the city, heading in the opposite direction from Dagobah Beach. It was a part of the city that he was only familiar with through maps, meaning that there wouldn't be anyone here that would recognize him. And it was a medium better part of town, meaning that, with any luck, there shouldn't be anyone who would recognize Jiran either. A nice, neutral territory for a first meeting. The cafe Izuku walked into had good reviews, but he honestly didn't care about how good their coffee was. What Izuku cared about was that it was busy this time of day, which means that there's enough ambient noise that he and Jiran would be able to talk without being overheard. And there was the added bonus that no one would be suspicious of over two strangers sharing a table. Izuku walked up to the counter and gave his order. Now, all there was left is for his stalker to take the bait. It didn't take long at all for Jiran to enter the cafe, at least considering how long he'd stubbornly insisted on following Izuku. If he'd taken any longer, Izuku was considering messaging the guy to just come inside. The boy watched the broker wait in line out of the corner of his eye, chuckling when he noticed that Jiran had even put out his ever-present cigarette. He was halfway through his coffee when Jiran slid into the seat across from him. "I was wondering if you were ever going to talk to me." A look of shock briefly crossed the broker's face before he let out a surprised laugh. "You knew I was following you?" "I make a living being more observant than most people. Of course I knew." "What I don't know is why you insisted on observing for a full week before coming to talk to me. You must have had pretty good intel on who I was. Watching my daily routine wasn't going to change that." Jiran chuckled and shook his head. "Well, it took me a week to be sure I had the right guy. Even now, you're sitting here and confirming it, and I'm still not sure." Izuku hummed. "Yeah, I guess my weak and innocent act does tend to throw people off. If it almost fooled you, then just imagine what the heroes be thinking when they have their pride on the line." Jiran smiled. "Now there's a ruthless mastermind we know and love. You've been doing pretty well for yourself online from what I've heard, but you know you're not going to be able to hide in the shadows forever, right?" Izuku sighed and put down his cap. "Yeah, the copycats are already starting to get on my nerves." He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "That's why I need your help. You're the best at what you do, right?" Jiran raised his eyebrows as he took the folder and began looking through it. There was a design for a villain costume, and a list of weapons that Izuku thought he'd need, including a lot of knives. The broker looked over the design silently for a few minutes and then nodded. "This should be doable, but I should warn you it'll cost a pretty penny, the weapons especially." "You know what my rates are, Jiran. I can afford it. Plus, I'll even let you introduce me to a few of the contacts you've been hounding me about." Jiran smiled. "You sure know how to tell a man what he wants to hear. I'll start calling around, but you'll be packing some serious heat." Jiran pulled out the weapons list and placed it in front of Izuku. "You sure you know how to use all of these?" Izuku shook his head. "Not yet. That's actually the last thing I need your help with." Jiran cocked his eyebrows, still smiling, and gestured for him to continue. "I want to meet Himiko Toga." That wiped the smile off of the broker's face. "The serial killer?" he asked in shock. Izuku nodded. "You've followed me, so I trust you know about my quirk situation." Jiran nodded hesitantly. "Well, since I don't have a quirk to fall back on, I'm going to need to rely primarily on weapons. Knives are the best option for both close combat and range once you factor in throwing knives, and there's no one better than Toga when it comes to knives. I want her to teach me how to fight." Jiran was solemn now. "I hate to ask, but what if she kills you?" Izuku just smiled, wondering if it had made him just a little bit crazy that he was asking to be trained by a serial killer. "I think I can hold my own. Besides, you won't let her kill me. I'll be making you too much money." Izuku started to get up to leave, but Jiran grabbed his arm. Now, before you leave, I've got a gift for you. He grabbed the laptop bag from the floor and put it on the table. This is top of the line, virtually untraceable. Internet cafes are great and all, but I think you'll agree this is the easier option. Izuku booted up the computer and looked it over. It was nice, and it really would make his work a lot easier. He quickly checked to make sure there wasn't any tracking apps or spyware installed before closing it. Meanwhile, Jiran pulled out a simple smartphone. This is also untraceable. I already have the number, and put it on my contact info as you. I'll text you an address when your gear is ready and you can pick it up. I'll also text you when I manage to get a hold of Toga. She's slippery, but she shouldn't be too hard to find. I'll be honest, I really hope you know what you're doing. Izuku just tucked his phone into his pocket and slung the laptop bag over his shoulder as he stood and grabbed his cup. If I didn't, I wouldn't have chosen to call myself Mastermind. Jiran watched the boy leave. This kid is crazy. His smile turned greedy. Look out, heroes. Mastermind is here to stay. Chapter 6. Learning. Izuku checked the address Jiran had given him to make sure that he was in the right place before going in, letting the door swing on its hinges behind him. The travel agency he was in was obviously a front. The bored young woman at the front desk fixing him with an unpleasant stare that very obviously said, "You're lost, idiot. Get out of here before you hurt yourself." Izuku just ignored it, walking up to the desk with the sweetest smile on his face. "Hi, I have an appointment with Jiran. He said he had a package for me." The girl continued staring at him for a minute before she gave up and sighed. "If you're sure, Squirt. What's the name?" Izuku's smile got wider. "Mastermind." He almost laughed as she did a double take, suddenly much more awake. Just a moment, sir." Her voice shook slightly. "I'll let him know you've arrived." Izuku nodded and found a seat in the lobby as the receptionist made a call. He was pretending to look at the magazine when the door swung open and a blonde girl in a loose school uniform came skipping in and leaned over the receptionist's desk. "Hiya, baby. You're cute. Jiran said he wanted to see me. Do you know why? Was it to meet you? I like your shirt, by the way. It's such a pretty shade of red. Red's my favorite color. I love seeing everyone in it. You just came prepared." Izuku smirked at the cornered look on the receptionist's face as Toga encroached further and further into her personal space. She was saved by Jiran coming out the back. "Mastermind, pleasure to see you again. Nice to see the phone I gave you is working well." "It's working wonderfully, thanks," Izuku replied. "The laptop as well. If the other gear I've ordered is even half that quality, I don't think I'll order from anyone else." "That's what I like to hear." Jiran clapped him on the back and turned towards the receptionist and Toga, who was looking at Izuku hungrily. "Toga, I'll be with you in just a few minutes. Can you find something to entertain yourself out here with in the meantime?" The receptionist looked faint as Toga smiled widely at her, her fangs on full display. "Your poor receptionist," Izuku said when the two arrived at Jiran's office. "Yeah," Jiran replied, "but remind me whose fault it is that Toga's here to begin with." "Point taken," Izuku chuckled. "So, you have my villain outfit?" Instead of replying, Jiran just took a large box out and put it on his desk. Izuku looked over the contents, inspecting the armored pants, shirt, and jacket before moving on to the gas mask. Overall, it was simple and more than a little plain compared to the flashy hero costumes plastered all over the news, and it was exactly what Izuku wanted. "It all looks good. And the weapons?" "In the gym, where you'll be training with Toga. Speaking of, I really don't like the idea of having to find a new receptionist. I just barely hired this one. The gym is the last door on the left. I'll go get Toga and meet you there." Izuku nodded as he made his way down the hall. He tried a few of the other doors, but they were all locked. Good. Jiran's not a trusting idiot. The gym wasn't huge, but there was enough room to move around comfortably. There was a wide variety of different sized boxes stacked against the wall so that they could train with obstacles when they were ready, and there was a large display of weapons on the wall beside the door. Izuku guessed that this room was normally used for demonstrations of the most common weapons Jiran sold. He noticed an innocent-looking cardboard box sitting on the ground under the weapons display, and was halfway to wondering what was inside of it before he saw the name Mastermind written in small black letters in one corner. He smiled and opened it. All the weapons he'd ordered were there, as well as a few extra training versions, which were basically the same except dull instead of sharp. Is this really him? Is Mastermind? He's so tiny. It's a wonder this girl was such an effective killer, considering she probably wouldn't know stealth if it bit her in the ass. Izuku really hoped that this wasn't one of those smart people make stupid decisions moments, because he wasn't really ready to die today. Maybe he should have put his affairs in order before showing up. Something must have shown on his face, because Jiran laughed. I would say she won't bite, but I honestly don't know. Yeah, Toga, this kid's Mastermind. Don't let his size fool you. He's probably one of the smartest villains I ever met. Mastermind, I'm sure you already know this is Himiko Toga. Considering you're the one who wanted this meeting. Ooh, Himiko squealed. Mastermind knows who I am, and he's so cute. Oh, you need a cute nickname to match, like Stainy. Mastermindy? Master-chan? Mind-chan. Mind-chan! That's perfect! Jiran said you'd ask for me, Mind-chan. Why does a cutie like you want to meet an adorable killer like me? Izuku swallowed all his doubts and smiled. It was getting easier to understand her the more he listened. Her excitement wasn't too different from his own ramblings after all, and Jiran probably wouldn't let him kill her. Probably. Well, you probably know that not many people have met me, yet, so, I need to learn how to defend myself, and, you're really good at knife combat, so, yeah. He cringed and saw Jiran mirroring the expression. Smooth. Toga, however, didn't really care. Wow! So you want me to teach you how to fight, Mind-chan? That's so cool! I don't really know what I'm doing half the time. I just like to see people in red, so I don't know if I'll be a good teacher, but it'll be lots of fun to try. Despite his common sense screaming at him to get away as far as possible, her enthusiasm was contagious. Perfect, Toga-sensei! If you'll try your best to be a good teacher, I'll try my best to be a good student. It was Toga's turn to cringe. Toga-sensei, that's not cute at all. Just call me Himiko, Mind-chan. And then she ran at him with a knife. Izuku didn't think he'd been more sore ever in his life. He was currently stretched out on the couch, icing his bruises with bags of frozen peas. Thankfully, the training knives he and Toga had been using only left bruises instead of slashes. Toga wasn't too happy about that. She insisted that red was a much prettier color than purple. Izuku heard the door open, but didn't bother moving. He wasn't even sure he could at this point, but maybe that was just being dramatic. Oh, Izuku, sweetie, are you okay? Hi, Mom. Izuku tried to smile, but it came out as more of a pained grimace. I just spent the afternoon with some friends. One of them is pretty good at martial arts, and she was trying to teach me. She's just really enthusiastic. His mom didn't seem any less worried, but she seemed to decide to take his word for it. Did you learn a lot? What is she like? Izuku lit up. Yeah, I did. We basically spent the whole time going over some basics and getting them into my body. She said I'm a really fast learner. What else? Like I said, she's really enthusiastic, and not just about fighting. Himiko does just about everything with twice as much effort as anyone else. So she's actually a lot of fun to be around. It was a little intimidating at first, but I'm getting used to her, so it's not too bad. Mom was the one smiling now. I'm so happy you're making friends, Izuku. She sounds really nice. Maybe you should bring her around for dinner sometime. Yeah, no, that would not be happening. You've been so happy these past few months. I was so worried about you after Koski was attacked by that awful villain. You were just so quiet for months after, and then that whole thing with you trying to find a job. I don't know what changed, but you seem to be thriving now. Izuku thought about it for a minute. It definitely hadn't been a smooth transition from wannabe hero to up-and-coming villain, but he was happier now. He thought of his fight with Toga and how she didn't ever ask about his quirk, just pouted that she wasn't allowed to make him bleed. He thought of Jiran and how he treated him like an equal. He thought of his overflowing inbox full of people who respected him and wanted to be associated with him, and he felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth as he looked up at his mom. Yeah, I guess I am. I found people who like me, and I'm doing something I enjoy. For the first time in a while, I think I'm really happy. Chapter 7. Face to Face. Mastermind looked back at Izuku from the full-length mirror in Jiran's office. He didn't want to get dressed in his villain outfit at home and potentially risk getting caught by his mom or the neighbors. If everything went well tonight, he'd be finding his own base soon enough, but until then, Jiran's office would have to do. His villain outfit was practical, but still managed to look intimidating, or at least it would if Izuku wasn't so short. The black armored pants were fitted but flexible and were paired with a black armored shirt made from the same material, but what tied the outfit together was the jacket. It was dark green, and it had a hood that he pulled up, his hair peeking out just from underneath it. There were dozens of pockets that had smoke bombs, grenades, flashbangs, and, of course, his knives. He also had knives strapped to each of his legs, and a few hidden in his dark red boots for emergencies. After a month of training with Toga, he was deadly with a knife, if not quite as good as his teacher. The last thing he put on was his mask. It was solid black and covered his entire face below the nose. It didn't look like a standard gas mask, looking instead like a simple ski mask, but Guran assured him that it would filter out any harmful gas attacks. Looking in the mirror, the effect was stunning. The knives alone would have been intimidating, but the hood partially shaded Izuku's face so that the only distinguishing feature was his bright green eyes, lit with a deadly sort of fire. He loved it. Guran had arranged a face-to-face meetup now that Toga said he probably wouldn't die immediately as soon as he was attacked. The meeting was with a small gang that had territory in eastern Tokyo and were waiting to rob a casino. Izuku himself was still considered small-time, even if he was becoming well-known, so Jiran said this was a good chance for Mastermind to start showing his face, even if it was behind a mask. Looking pretty snazzy. Jiran was leaning against the door frame, smoking his ever-present cigarette. I'd say knock him dead, but that'd be bad for business. Izuku rolled his eyes again, marveling at how they stood out against his outfit. Let's go. The sooner I get this over with, the sooner I can pretend I'm not nervous. Jiran chuckled, but grabbed his keys. You're such a smart kid, I keep forgetting how new to the game you are. Usually it takes years for a small fry like you to get to this point in their careers. Yeah, well, normally small fries don't make a living killing heroes. The drive to the warehouse was short, but maybe that was because there's not really any traffic at 2 o'clock in the morning. As they walked in, Guran and Mastermind were met with a dozen armed guards surrounding a man almost as big as Fat Gum, who was obviously the head honcho. Izuku immediately started analyzing, matching the people with the quirks he saw to the research he had done before. The head honcho was sneering at him. Jiran, I said I wanted to meet with Mastermind, not some kid who's still wearing diapers. What kind of joke are you trying to pull here? Jiran just smirked. Izuku was fairly certain that was his default expression, but there was no possibility that he was genuinely amused by the situation. Yeah, I know he doesn't look like much, but I guarantee you he's the real deal. Apparently you don't have to be tall to be smart. Izuku's nervousness was slowly morphing into anger and determination. If there was anything he was used to from his life before villainy, it was jerks who thought it was their right to look down on him. The head honcho had gone on a rant about Jiran not taking him seriously and how he was powerful and blah blah blah. Izuku just sat down on the chair provided for him and spoke quietly, the determination in his voice and his eyes passing for confidence in his words. Takumi Fujito, age 42. Quirk, spines. You convert the fat in your body into spines that can be detached. However, they have a tendency to bleed when you do that, so you avoid detaching them if at all possible. Family. You have a wife that you married 10 years ago and 4 kids, all under the age of 15. Your youngest just turned 6 last Wednesday, but congratulations, by the way. Weaknesses. Your family. And your dependence on your quirk. You also have a severe allergy to shellfish. Did I get anything wrong? The room had gone completely silent, and Izuku smiled innocently behind his mask and looked directly at the head honcho, who gulped. So, Izuku said presently, shall we begin? Detective Sakachi rubbed his eyes in frustration before taking another gulp of his coffee. The Mastermind case was rapidly turning from a minor headache to a massive migraine. The guy had been on the scene for less than 10 months, and he was already becoming one of the most dangerous villains the detective had ever been asked with finding. He looked at the file again, filled with whatever neatly written plans he had managed to confiscate from villains and a handful of blurry photographs pulled from security cameras in internet cafes. All the evidence pointed to one thing. Mastermind was a ghost. The police hadn't even known about his existence until months after his first murder, and it was the media who first caught on to the fact that all the recent hero deaths were connected. The heroes and police hadn't even thought to check. Why would they? Each murder was committed by different people with different quirks, and there wasn't any signature connecting the deaths. It wasn't until Nezu noticed that the villains committing crimes weren't smart enough to pull off the kinds of heists that they were doing, and began looking for a strategist rather than a serial killer, a strategist for hire. Looking at it now, it seemed obvious and simple. The murders were only possible because there was some kind of genius pulling the strings from behind, making sure that the villains knew every possible weakness and how to exploit it. Nezu was anxious to catch Mastermind, mostly because he wanted an intellectual to play chess with. But Tsukachi wanted to catch him because the more his influence grew, the more dangerous he became. The only comforting fact about the entire case was that Mastermind never agreed to in-person meetups, which limited his influence considerably. If the police and heroes could catch him before he got the courage to show his face, then they might be able to nip this in the bud. But Mastermind was starting to change his MO, and that made Tsukachi nervous. For a long time, Mastermind had used internet cafes to communicate with the villains that hired him, which had been the only solid leads the police could get on the guy, as thin as it was. He had been caught on camera multiple times, but he always kept his hood up and seemed to know where the cameras were placed, so they still had no idea what he really looked like. Sakachi and Sansa had gone to interview employees at the various cafes, but they didn't know about Mastermind until several months after he became active. It had been too long for most to remember a random guy in a hoodie. The only thing they had to show for the interviews was one clerk who remembered a young man with green hair, but even he admitted it could have been black and the harsh fluorescent lights were just messing with his eyes. So, in short, they had nothing, but they were tracking any specific activity at dozens of internet cafes in the city. And then he stopped using them. The crimes continued, accelerated even, but there was no physical sign of Mastermind anywhere. Sakachi and the rest of the police could only guess that he had either bought some sort of untraceable tech, or he'd figured out to build it himself. Either way, their most solid lead had gone cold, and they were right back to where they started. Well, almost. At least they knew the guy existed now. A slight movement out of the corner of his eye made Tsukachi reflexively drop the file and reach for his gun. Hey now, I didn't think I was being that quiet. Tsukachi curbed his panic for long enough to recognize the long white scarf, tangled hair, and the tired eyes of the hero in front of him. He sighed in relief. Eraser, sorry, I didn't hear you coming. He looked at the papers spread across the floor. Got lost in thought, I guess. Eraser grunted in response. I guess I should apologize on sneaking up on you. Stealth is just kind of a reflex for underground heroes. Takes too much work to turn it off. No, Tsukachi shook his head. It's not a problem. So, why are you here, Eraserhead? Normally you go straight to sleep after patrols. Eraserhead's expression, minute as the change was, turned grim. I heard something concerning from one of my informants and needed to let you know as soon as possible. He glanced down at the file that was still lying in disarray at their feet. I have something else to add to your file. Tsukachi perked up, half in excitement and half in dread. While he'd hoped Eraser was bringing good news, his grim attitude made that much less likely. Please, tell me you have some sort of lead on how to find him. Even as he said it, he knew it was a useless hope. If Eraser was bringing something like that, he'd be smiling, as unhinged as the hero's smile was. As expected, Eraser shook his head and frowned. Much worse. According to my contact over the past week, Mastermind has met with the leaders of several minor gangs. In person. Eraser waited a moment for the news to sink in, watching all the overworked cogs in Tsukachi's brain finish turning to the correct positions. And when they did... Fuck! Chapter 8. Entrance Exam. Are you sure you're ready for this, Mind-chan? Zuko just rolled his eyes, ignoring the lump of guilt, excitement, and doubt that had been steadily growing in his gut all day. Himiko, you realize I have killed people before, right? I know that, silly. It's just... She looked at him softly. You've never taken a life with your own hands. It's different than just making murder plans and letting other people act them out. The blood will be on your hands. No one else's. There's no coming back from this. Izuku took a deep breath and started playing with his favorite knife. Yeah, I guess you're right, but... Izuku's eyes took on a determined glint. I think I need to do this. I mean, in the eyes of the law, I'm already a killer, so it's not like it'll save me a prison sentence even if I never do it myself, and... Well, I think I need to prove to myself that I can, you know? My whole life, I've been told that I can't do anything everyone else can do, and I can't be a hero, I can't be a useful member of society, I can't be human. Hell, my own dad left because I was so useless. If I let everyone else do my dirty work forever, isn't that proving everyone right? Yeah, I'm smart, but when it comes down to the wire, I really am the useless Deku that everyone always told me that I am. He looked over at Himiko, crouched beside him on the rooftop while they waited for their prey to pass through the alley below. I need to do this. I know that I'm capable of it. I just need to actually, do it. Does that make any sense? Not really to me, but I've never been one for big ideals. She got a contemplative look on her face. I mostly just kill people to see them bleed, which other people think is a dumb reason too, so I think that if it makes sense to you, can it really be wrong? I mean, any more wrong than murder is, anyway? Izuku laughed. That really shouldn't have been as comforting as it is. Thanks, Himiko. You're a great friend. She smiled, her fangs glinting in the dim light of the nearby street lamp before her eyes brightened in excitement. She grabbed Izuku's shoulder and shook him roughly. Mind-chan! Mind-chan! She whispered, somehow still managing to convey mania as if she were yelling at the top of her lungs. She's here! Izuku focused on the woman entering the alley below them. Hero name, Glimmer. Sidekick at the Uwabami agency. Quirk, Sparkles. She can refract light to produce a glittery effect around her body that she uses to blind and disorient her opponents. Weaknesses. She's susceptible to the blinding of her own sparkles. She uses dark glasses as part of her hero costume to minimize this effect, but right now, she's coming off a day shift in the dark of night in civilian clothes, and dark glasses would just get in the way. Izuku smiled as he put on his own dark goggles to shield his eyes before grabbing a pair of throwing knives. Glimmer cried out as one stabbed her in the shoulder, and the other lodged itself in her thigh, preventing her from running away. She instinctively surrounded herself with sparkles, but had to shield her eyes with her hand. She reached for her pocket, where she kept an extra pair of sunglasses, only to receive a swift kick to the hand, and as soon as she managed to grab them. She could tell by the sound of them hitting the floor that they were most likely cracked and useless. She dimmed her quirk enough that she could still see somewhat. She could just barely make out two figures behind the bright sparkles. One was hanging back, but the other was stalking towards her, with knives in each hand. A knife-hand quirk, perhaps. Glimmer shook her head. That's not important right now. She needed to focus on staying alive. She launched a punch at her attacker, only for him to dodge at the last second. How? Even dimmed, she knew her sparkles made it difficult to see her movements. It seemed it was her opponent's turn to attack, as he ran close to her with a knife and gave her a deep cut on the side of the neck. Her eyes widened in pain and realization as she saw dark goggles on his face. She stumbled backwards, trying to get out of range before he came at her again, thanking every deity that she could think of that her hurt leg didn't give out from the movement. Glimmer was starting to hyperventilate. She didn't have her glasses, and her opponent's gear limited the effectiveness of her quirk anyways. She was also injured and bleeding heavily, while she hadn't even managed to land a hit on him. They fought for another few minutes, but for every hit she managed to get in, he gave her another few cuts or stabs. She hadn't been this scared since the first time she'd run into a major villain during her first internship. Her mentor had been there to save her then, but no one was going to come and save her now. She stilled and prepared to stand her ground as the last desperate strategy occurred to her. There was a risk that she might go blind, but hopefully it would incapacitate her attacker long enough for her to get away. She slammed her hands over her screwed-shut eyes and sparkled brighter than she ever had in her life. She had never poured this much energy into her quirk because, even with standard dark glasses, this much light could cause permanent damage. Just as she was about to cut her quirk and run for her life, she felt the knife slide between her ribs. If her eyes hadn't been closed, she would have been concerned about just how dark her vision was. As her legs finally gave out beneath her, and she succumbed to quirk exhaustion and blood loss. Izuku waited for the last sparkles to fizzle out before taking off his glasses. He'd had to close his eyes during that last attack, but the glasses Jiran had provided him had done a wonderful job of protecting him. He watched the last bit of life drain from Glimmer's eyes as Himiko came to stand behind him. "So?" she drawled. "That looked like fun. How do you feel?" Izuku knew that the him of 10 months ago would have probably thrown up at the realization of what he'd just done, but all he felt was a sick sense of pride, just like that first time that a villain had honestly thanked him for coming up with that plan to kill Mount Lady. "I feel good." He smiled at Himiko as he retrieved whatever knives were still stuck in the hero, cleaning them off and putting them away. "I think I told you that when we were planning this today, that UA had the entrance exam." Himiko nodded. "Well, I've just been thinking about how proud my bully was when I saw him walking home this afternoon, and honestly, I think I've got him beat." This was like his own personal entrance exam, his own proof that he was a real villain. Izuku liked the poetic irony. It was just as ironic as a hero fanboy growing up to kill heroes because of the words of the #1 hero in Japan. Sirens were starting to grow closer, most likely drawn by the bright light of Glimmer's final stand, but that wasn't important. Izuku and Himiko had plenty of time to get out of there before anyone else showed up. "Come on, Himiko," he said. "Let's go celebrate." Chapter 9. Caught. Tsukachi checked his gun one last time and radioed the heroes who were coming on the raid. "Everyone in position?" "Ready," Eraserhead responded. He was waiting in the rafters at the warehouse, hidden in the shadows. The current theory was that Mastermind had some sort of analysis quirk, but there was always the possibility he could have something more offensive, so they couldn't be too careful. "Ready." Kamui Woods had insisted on being part of the raid. He and Mount Lady might have stepped on each other's toes, but they had been friends. In his mind, Mastermind might not have wielded the knife that killed her, but he was still responsible for her death. Ready, Nezu stood behind Tsukachi. It wasn't often that he physically came on missions, but he was the only one that could match Mastermind in intellect, just in case there was something that Eraserhead could erase. Eraserhead's informant had caught wind of the deal a few days ago, and plainclothes officers on the scene had confirmed that Mastermind entered the warehouse 20 minutes ago. Tsukachi took a deep breath to calm his nerves. It'd be over soon. Move in. Izuku was unimpressed. This group of drug dealers was hardly worth the trouble of meeting with, but Jiran had vouched for them, so he'd given them the benefit of the doubt. But seriously, all they wanted to do was to make sure a rival group stopped encroaching on their territory? Kill their men! Send a message! Hiring a professional strategist was just redundant. He sighed. These guys were idiots. All of a sudden, the warehouse exploded in movement as dozens of cops came pouring in and restraining the drug dealers. Izuku cried out as he was wrapped in branches. He swore, heroes. A loud voice came from the megaphone outside. Mastermind, this is Detective Tsukachi from the Japanese police force. You are under arrest for accessory to multiple murders and other crimes. Do not resist. Izuku chuckled desperately as his mind raced for a way out of the situation. The heroes had gotten the drop on him, but he knew better than anyone that every hero has a weakness. He slumped and bowed his head, hiding his smile as he felt Kamui Wood's lacquered chain prison loosen slightly. He silently thanked his bullies for teaching him how to pretend that he'd given up, all while reaching in his pocket. Knives wouldn't do much good against his current opponent. Kamui would be able to regrow his branches much faster than Izuku would be able to cut through them, but he had more tricks up his sleeve. He grinned as his hand finally grasped what he was looking for. Good thing his costume was flameproof. Kamui Wood screamed as his branches were charred and he reflexively let go. Izuku hit the floor in a roll, but didn't let up his grip on the miniature flamethrower, instead targeting Kamui's main body. He made a break for the back of the warehouse and laughed that he felt triumph radiating from the police, thinking they'd managed to corner him. He took a grenade from one of his pockets and pulled the pin before throwing it at the wall. Just because there wasn't a back door here doesn't mean he couldn't make one. Shit! He took out Kamui and he blew out the back wall. Head him off, quickly, before he gets away! Izuku vaulted over the rubble into the back alley and behind the warehouse and looked around and decided which direction to run in. If he went left, he'd run right into the arms of police. He turned right, but he felt his body wrapped up for the second time this night. Fuck! He swore under his breath. Of course this was how he gets caught. What would his mom think? He supposed he should have expected something after how quickly he'd risen through the villain ranks. How did the phrase go? The faster they rise, the quicker they fall? Something like that? Izuku desperately looked around and saw Eraserhead staring at him, hair floating around him like some sort of devil's halo. If he hadn't been so scared, then he would have laughed that they sent Eraserhead after a quirkless kid. As it was, he couldn't suppress a deranged giggle, and the hero looked at him in suspicion. What's so funny? You can't use your quirk. You can't get away. Just give yourself up. This just made Izuku laugh harder because he knew how to escape. Eraserhead wasn't used to people fighting back after their quirks were taken away, unlike Kamui's branches. Eraser's scarf was easy to cut through. Eraserhead reared back at the manic look in the villain's eyes as he looked up and didn't see how he grasped the knife in each hand. He made quick work of the capture weapon and threw one of his knives at Eraserhead. The hero managed to dodge, only to be blinded by a bright flash of light as soon as he turned back to look at his opponent. By the time he could open his eyes again, Mastermind was nowhere to be seen. Izuku watched from the rooftop as Eraserhead looked around for him before heading into the warehouse. Heroes and cops would start canvassing the area soon. They'd probably already set up a perimeter. He crept to the edge of the roof so that he could see where the police were gathered. Most of them were still clearing the warehouse or loading the drug dealers into police cruisers, but some were having to hold back the crowd that was starting to form as people from a nearby shopping district rushed to see what all the commotion was about. Izuku smiled as an idea occurred to him, and he slipped off his mask and took off his jacket. Folding it to look like a bag, he quickly gathered all of his nice weapons and put them in his jacket. It might have looked weird in the middle of the day, but under the cover of darkness and chaos, he just looked like a kid who'd been out a little too late with friends. He shimmied down the fire escape and took out his phone, setting it to record right as he came into view not too far from the police line. "Hey, kid, you're not supposed to be back here." An officer rushed and grabbed him roughly by the arm. "Sorry, officer, but I heard there were heroes and my friends dared me and..." Izuku lifted his phone helplessly as the officer rolled his eyes. "Don't be stupid, kid. There's a dangerous villain out tonight. The police line is there to protect you. You and your friends can get autographs at HeroCon." And with that, Izuku was escorted outside of the police line, with firm instructions to never do anything like that again. Izuku stayed with the crowd a few minutes, watching Nezu talk to Tsukachi, who looked more and more tired with every officer or hero that came to talk to him. An ambulance had been called for Kamui, and the media had already started up showing by the time Izuku left. No one paid a second glance to the plain-looking boy making his way from all the chaos, and he made it home without incident. He crawled through his window and drew shuddering breaths as distress finally hit him. Tears leaked from his eyes, and he wiped them away in frustration. It seemed that being a feared villain did not make him any less of a crybaby. That had been too close. If he hadn't had his flamethrower, or if they'd sent different heroes... Izuku cut off that train of thought before it could paralyze him. He still needed to lock away his villain gear and shower away the dust and soot that was sticking to him from the fire and from the explosion, and most importantly, he needed to find a way to make sure this never happened again. Chapter 10. Hostages. "What is this goddamn world coming to?" Mitsuki exclaimed. "Just last night, that fucker Mastermind gave the heroes a slip. Put a hero in the hospital too, from what I heard. It's just terrible. I just wish they'd catch him already. It's nerve-wracking every time I turn on the news now. I'm so worried for Katsuki when he starts in the UA," Inko fretted. "Yeah, right. Like some weak fucker like Mastermind could beat me," Katsuki said. "They should have sent stronger heroes to the raid. The reason why the hero got hurt is because he was weak." "Shut up, brat. Don't go speaking ill of the injured like that." Izuku played with his food and tried not to react. Dinner with the Bakugos was always difficult, and having to act natural with Katsuki so his friend wouldn't have any reason to kill him, but it was even harder when he was the topic of conversation. Izuku wanted nothing more than to take credit for any of his crimes, or to even kill Katsuki right then and there to prove that he wasn't weak, but he was smart enough to realize how stupid that would be. He just escaped the hero raid with his identity intact. He wasn't about to go giving himself away now. It still didn't make it any easier to navigate the conversation. "Well, I'm just grateful that it didn't end up any worse," Masaru said quietly. Inko looked at him like he'd grown a second head. "He got away and the hero was injured. How could it have gone any worse?" Masaru set down his fork and looked at Inko. "According to a friend of mine with the police, a huge crowd gathered slowly after the raid began. They were worried Mastermind would take hostages. We're just lucky he disappeared." Izuku's head snapped up its cogs and his brain started turning. Hostages, he thought. Now there is an idea. "Did you enjoy your dinner with Katsuki's family? You're kind of tired tonight." Yeah, it was great, as always. I'm kind of tired. I think I'm just gonna go to bed early." "Don't you want to watch the news?" Ingo looked at him with concern, but Izuku just shook his head. It'd all be about the failed raid anyways. "Good night, Mom." Ingo looked like he wanted to protest, but pity won out. "Okay, Izuku, good night." He shut his door and immediately went to his desk and opened up the untraceable laptop he'd gotten from Jiren. Hostages! It was such a simple idea that it would be extremely effective, because the first rule of hero work was to prioritize the rescue. Anytime a hostage was in danger, the heroes would have to do whatever necessary to keep the hostage safe rather than catch the villain. But who to take? Izuku sighed. Kidnapping civilians and holding them somewhere just wasn't practical. As shitty as his life was outside of villainy, it still existed. He didn't just have an underground bunker somewhere to keep hostages fed and alive for an indeterminate amount of time. If only he could just threaten to kill more heroes if they caught him or something, but he'd be caught, and he wouldn't be able to kill them. He paused. Mastermind never had to be physically present to kill anyone, as long as he had interested buyers. It was one of the reasons why it had taken the police so long to acknowledge his existence. Zuko smiled slowly. What he had in mind would take a lot of preparation, and he wouldn't be able to do it alone. But he was sure it would make an impact. He opened up his Mastermind account and drafted a message to a hacker named La Brava that Jiren had recommended. The heroes wouldn't know what hit him. If there was anything good that came from the failed Mastermind raid, it was that the guy hadn't shown his face for 2 weeks. Tsukachi didn't know if he should be happy the guy wasn't committing crimes, or frustrated that they couldn't find him. But the fact remained that Mastermind had gone immediately after the raid, and hadn't been heard from since. Nezu warned he might be planning something, but Tsukachi didn't know what it could be. He just decided he'd count his blessings. That the media had finally stopped camping in front of the station trying to get statements. It was bad enough that the vultures had finally got a hold of the fact that Kamui Woods wasn't just injured, but had been viciously burned alive. He'd been lucky to survive, but there would be a lengthy recovering process before he'd be able to return to hero work. Tsukachi's thoughts were interrupted by his phone ringing. Hello? Detective, are you watching the news? Nezu's voice sounded worried and an alarm bell started ringing in Tsukachi's head. He'd heard the principal sound gleeful, sad, even frustrated, but he'd never heard him sound worried before. Turn to Channel 5. Tsukachi grabbed the remote to the small TV by his desk and turned it on to find 2 terrified-looking news anchors looking into the camera. Left on the desk of the main producer of our station this morning, with instructions to air it or our entire production team would be killed. We do not know yet what is on the tape, so we urge viewers to stop watching, as there is a possibility that it could contain sensitive information or images that could be triggering to some viewers. The screen cut to a dark green background. A black circle with a capital M inside of it was superimposed on the green, and Tsukachi found it hard to breathe. He'd seen that symbol before, in some of Mastermind's latest plans. It was sort of a signature he'd added in the past few months, probably to discourage copycats. This was bad. The image faded to reveal Mastermind in a dark room, his toxic green eyes looking directly into the camera. His voice was somewhat distorted, but it still sounded young and male. Hello. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mastermind. I'm the strategist behind the recent uptick in hero deaths. You're welcome, he said cheerfully. So, some of you may have heard already, but the heroes almost managed to capture me next week. He slow clapped. Congratulations, heroes, and I'd say better luck next time, but he turned deadly serious. There won't be a next time. You see, this video was just a courtesy to let you know that this is now a hostage situation. If I am caught or killed, the murder plans for all top 50 heroes will be automatically released to interested buyers. Tsukachi couldn't look away. Taking the top 50 heroes hostage? Mastermind couldn't be serious. Now, I know what you're thinking. But Mastermind, heroes can defend themselves. He can't take them hostage. His eyes took on a wicked glint. But you see, that's where you're wrong. I've proved over a dozen times that heroes aren't as invincible as you all want to believe. Just ask Come Out Lady. Stretch? Maybe Glimmer. Detective! Detective! Sukachi raised his phone. I'm here. Please tell me this is a bluff, Nezu pleaded. Please tell me he doesn't actually plan on doing this. Sukachi swallowed. My quirk hasn't registered any lies. Nezu swore. Another first for the principal. Now, Mastermind continued, in case you think this is a bluff, I am going to give you proof. I'll wait until this video airs, and then I will release the murder plans for pro hero Wash. He's in the top 10. Pretty competent hero by all accounts, so go ahead. Try and protect him. Frankly, I'm excited to see you try. Mastermind was smiling now if his eyes were any indication. And just remember, once he's dead, that if you catch or kill me, you're going to have a lot more dead heroes on your hands. You might be able to save some of the top 50, but there's no way you'll be able to save them all. Mastermind waved to the camera. Good luck! The screen cut back to the news anchors who began to discuss the footage, but Sukachi could hardly hear them. Mastermind had just gone from a dangerous up-and-coming villain to an S-ranked villain instantly, and they couldn't do a thing about it. I'm sorry, Wash. It'll just be a few days until we can determine Mastermind's threat level. It's okay, Detective. Wash held up his hands placatingly. I understand the need for extra security. Mastermind had Japan on edge even before he announced his plan to take pro heroes hostage. I just hope everything works out and we can catch him soon. Sukachi sighed and shook his head. You and me both. They were currently in a safe house, which meant that Wash had to take a few days off hero duty, but it wasn't the end of the world. At least this would prove that Japan and the police and heroes were able to protect the top 50 and render Mastermind's hostage situation harmless. It would all be worth it in the end. Start the stream, a voice called out, and Wash and Sukachi immediately went on high alert. There wasn't supposed to be anyone but them in there right now. The other officers weren't scheduled to arrive for another 20 minutes. Sukachi took out his gun and looked at Wash, who nodded in his head and took a place behind the detective. They flinched as an explosion sounded, and the door to the safe house flew open. 4 thugs ran in with gas masks, one holding a phone out in front of him. Sukachi fired as Wash shot a stream of water at the villains. All of a sudden, Wash spasmed and fell to the floor. Wash! Sukachi cried out. Ha! Water's an awesome conductor, isn't it, hero? The lead thug said. Sukachi aimed for him, only to realize that one of their quirks created a bulletproof shield, and all of his bullets fell ineffectually on the floor. He grabbed the lamp, the nearest thing he could use as a weapon, and stood in front of the conscious hero, preparing to make a last stand. One of the thugs rushed him, and Sukachi knocked him aside easily, but the next grabbed his lamp and forced him to grapple. All of a sudden, his opponent wouldn't let go of him and stood back, but rather than catching his breath, Sukachi stiffened as he felt electricity run through him, and he fell paralyzed against the couch. Make sure you get this all on camera. Mastermind wants the world to know what he's capable of. It's the least I can do to rid the world of the scum that arrested my brother. The thug with the camera nodded, and Sukachi watched helplessly as the lead villain took out a gun of his own and shot Wash twice in the chest. He paused for a moment, and then put another bullet in the hero's head. You can never be too sure, he laughed. Roaches like that are tough to kill. Come on, boys, let's go. Backup arrived as Sukachi was finally able to start moving again. He watched the paramedics rush to Wash first, only to shake their heads and come help him instead. Are you okay, sir? Can you move? Sukachi nodded and flinched. The paramedics continued asking him questions, and he answered numbly. Nezu arrived as they were leading him to the ambulance with a shock blanket around his shoulders. He must have looked pretty bad, because the principal immediately looked at him with concern. Are you okay, Detective? Sukachi shrugged. My entire body hurts like hell, but the paramedics say I'll be okay. Nezu got a strange look in his eyes. No, I mean, emotionally. Sukachi rubbed his eyes in frustration, and was surprised when he found that his hand came away wet. When had he started crying? The leader had an electric-type quirk. When Wash got hit with it, I thought he was unconscious, but it just paralyzed whoever got hit with it. He was awake the whole time, and so was I, and I had to... oh God, I had to just watch while they killed him, and I couldn't do anything about it. He looked at Nezu, helplessly. What are we going to do? Nezu looked back to where the media was already starting to gather, despite the fact that Wash's death had been live-streamed. I don't know, he whispered. I really don't know.